What is your most valuable possession? What would you be willing to die for? Throughout history, there have been courageous souls who accepted torture and death rather than give up their faith. To these, truth was worth dying for. Their persecutors could take from them family, friends, their jobs, their homes, and their possessions. But they could not take from them the love of God and their desire to obey Him according to His word and the dictates of their conscience.
We are standing here in the Criminal Museum of the medieval town Rothenburg ob der Tauber. And when we look at all of this equipment around us, we stand amazed at man's inhumanity to man. This is equipment that was used by the state to bring people to confess to various crimes. And later the church became involved, and whenever there was a suspect that somebody was spreading heretical information or was a heretic, then they would hand them over to the state, the inquisitors, and they would torture them to gain a confession from them. Now, the instruments that we see around us here are really quite incredible. This one here was a particular hoist where you could attach a person, and the way they would normally do that, they would tie the hands behind the back in this kind of fashion, and then raise the hands at the back and hook them over this hook, and then hoist the individual with this hoist. And depending on the severity, you could, well, attach these stones of various weights, or a number of them, to the feet, so that eventually the arms would be torn out of their sockets, and that would inflict incredible pain. Here you had a finger screw or thumb screws, however you wanted to use them. You could put various fingers under it, or you can put a thumb under it, and then screw it down and create quite a sensation of pain. It is incredible what people will think up in order to inflict pain. This one over here is particularly obnoxious because you would tie the person down. It could be on his stomach or on his back, and lay him along this bed, and there would be these rollers over here that can move with spikes on them, metal spikes, very sharp, that of course would inflict incredible pain. On the other end, you would hook this over a rope that tied the legs together, and then you would stretch the individual over the rack, driving these nails into the back or whichever side was in contact with them. These are more rollers. You could also assist with the rolling action over the other side. So it is incredible that people could actually do something like this. Over there we have the spike chair, and there is, well, the notion that maybe it was just a medium to frighten people, but there's also a fair amount of evidence that it was actually used. You would sit on those spiky metal spikes, have your feet inserted into that plank and screwed tighter and tighter, and well, that must have been a very uncomfortable way to sit. Now, all of these methodologies were used from the 14th century onwards, and it's interesting that it lasted for more than 400 years. Only in 1813 did they actually stop this process and removed it from the state of Bavaria. But to think that humanity could do this to humanity. Now, during the Inquisition, the Dominicans were the ones who controlled the Spanish Inquisition, and they handed people over to the state, and millions of people were subjected to this kind of process. Later on, when the Jesuits started the Counter-Reformation, they were responsible for the Inquisition in Rome. So you had these rival factions actually, or co-laborers in some instances, furthering this methodology. What is amazing is that they made no difference whether it was a man or a woman, they would be equally subjected to this procedure. And once again, it proves the fact that women are tougher than men because they were more able to handle the pain. It is claimed that some 60% of them could actually survive without a confession being tortured out of them. When heretics or supposed heretics were subjected to this kind of torture, it is interesting that the inquisitors would stand by and record the procedures. And the confessions were often forced from the individuals, and of course there were no confessions at all, because some people, just from the strength of the pain itself, relinquished and gave up and confessed to crimes that they had never committed. People were also ridiculed, they were paraded through the streets, normally with their clothes either torn or totally removed to shame them in public, and they were paraded through cages. So there were incredibly harsh mechanisms of dealing with criminology, something which is unthinkable today. But human nature has not changed. Human nature is still the same as it has always been. And could it be possible that man's inhumanity could once again rise to a level such as this? There's so much cruelty in the world, and if it weren't for the Spirit of God, where would we be? These are body clamps. They were designed to create pain and to distort positions and make people exceedingly uncomfortable. This one here in particular is quite interesting. You put your legs in there, your head in over there, and you could move it around so that the person would be crunched up and in exceedingly uncomfortable positions. There's another body and neck clamp that you could extend and stretch a person. A head clamp where you could turn those screws into the skull. Leg clamps. And up there is a picture of a severed hand. So it seems that the punishments that they had in the medieval times were very similar to some of the punishments we even have in religious systems of the world to this very day. So mankind still has the same nature. And it's only God holding back the winds that prevents humanity from going back to this kind of situation. During the Middle Ages, when the persecution of Christians, of Protestants, was being practiced by church and state in union, incarceration was, of course, one of the most common ways of dealing with these people. And they were put behind bars such as these with little hatches to feed them through under the most unhygienic conditions, in cold and damp and rat-infested environments with no facilities for personal hygiene. And to think that people were incarcerated in this way for years. Marie Durand was incarcerated for 38 years. And all she had to do was recant her Protestant position and she could have been let free. They used to parade her fiancé and ask him to beg her to give up her position. But she was determined to resist, and she wrote it in the rock. It's just unbelievable what people will go through to stand firm for righteousness and principle and truth, in spite of what the inhumanity of man can do to man. We would not know what all these instruments were actually for if it weren't for the fact that everything was so faithfully recorded. It was almost elevated to a level of art. And we have various books describing all the various ways of torture. Now, some of these instruments that we see over here are pretty vile. You have the general thumb screws and finger screws, and then you have over here the various leg screws and more thumb screws. And this one over here is particularly interesting. This one is a tongue screw. So you would place it over the tongue and screw it down to inflict maximum pain. But the most disgusting one of all is probably this one on the top here. This was a so-called mouth screw. And you can see there are two of them chained together, and that is for a particular reason. You could use only one, but you could also use two, depending on which side of the person you were working. And you would put this in the mouth and open the mouth, and sometimes you could open it so wide that the jaws could actually dislocate. And then you could throw various liquids down there, whether they were hot or whether they were cold, or whether they were just disgusting, like fecal brews and things like that. But you could also use it, well, if you use your imagination, on the other end of the body. And there were two of them chained together, and if you imagine female anatomy, then you could inflict the same torture with two of them inserted at the same time. To think that mankind could even conjure up things such as this to create this disgusting form of torture, it just boggles the mind. It's very interesting that torture was not a haphazard procedure. It was a very regulated procedure. There were very specific laws and law books written about exactly how this should be done. This one here dates from 1507, and it has all the regulations as to what must be done and how it may be done. Whenever there was a torture, then there were a number of people involved. You had the executioner, who was responsible for inflicting the torture. He was also responsible for executing the death sentence when necessary. And interesting about him is that he was also very au fait with how to deal with all the injuries that were inflicted. So he was like the medical man in the district, and apparently people would go to him to have their wounds dressed and healed. Then there were scribes that wrote down everything that happened. The witnesses were present, and the judge was also present. And in the case of the Inquisition, if it was a church matter, then the inquisitors were there to oversee the procedure. And if we move to the next one, we'll see that there was a protocol. Here we have a protocol of torture. This is a very specific document, and it's very well documented. They tell you exactly what happened. So this is how we know what happened in those days and how these torture procedures were carried out. This specific one here is a protocol of a witch, or a so-called witch, Katharina Rantzebach, and it's very faithfully recorded as to exactly what happened in the process of torture. If we go to the next one, you had protocol of witnesses. So there were two witnesses that wrote down exactly what happened. So everything was very, very regulated. And that's rather fascinating. In many, many regions in the world where nations or powers used torture, it's interesting that they also were regulated according to specific procedures. And here you even have a manual of the theory of torture. Now this is fascinating. Torture is, of course, designed to inflict maximum pain without necessarily leading to the death of the individual. You only want to extract a confession, whether a real confession or a forced confession doesn't matter. It was the way in which the pain should be inflicted without causing death. And in modern governments, we had very similar experiences with the various torture techniques used by various regimes over the ages and by secret organizations and secret police. And even in modern situations, we have very well regulated procedures. And some of them, for example, waterboarding in the United States, had to be approved by Congress before it could be introduced. So we seem to still have the tendency to hold on to some of these medieval practices. And who knows, man's inhumanity to man can possibly lead to a resurrection of these kinds of procedures. Let's pray that it does not happen. It is even possible that humanity could introduce these things again, because the inhumanity to man is still part and parcel of the fallen nature. I certainly hope that God intervenes before they get to these levels again.
Find out more in Conviction Episode 1, premiering September 1st, or join the exclusive premiere on August 12th by signing up on edtv.watch for your exclusive passcode.